Let's talk more about variables. So in the previous video we have talked about how to declare variables, and we learned 3 ways to declare them. But we also mentioned that all the values our variables were pointing at were primitive values. But we said that there are 2 types, or like 2 groups of values in JavaScript, which are primitive values and non-primitive values. In this video we will explore how to declare variables that point at non-primitive values. In the video about values, we have mentioned that there are 2 types of non-primitive values, which are objects and functions. Functions deserve their own video. So in this video, we will only take a look at the objects. So what are the objects? One way to think about objects is that it's just a bunch of variables that are grouped together into a single entity. For example, here, we have a variable called dwarf that is initialized to an object. So we use object as a value for variable dwarf. An object has something that we called properties. We have said that you can see an object as a bunch of variables grouped together. So when they are grouped together inside the object, we don't call them variables anymore. We call them properties of the object. Properties have names, and they also point at values, same way as variables do. Our object dwarf has 3 properties: first name that points at Thorin, alias Oakenshield, and third one age that points at value 195. When we print this object, we'll see something like this: first name, alias, and age, like we have specified here. And we can check the type of this thing by printing it using the type of expression, and we get an object. So it's indeed an object. But you see, this syntax, it resembles the block statement. That's why I have placed an example of a block statement here. And you can see it very much resembles the object. It also has curly brackets and some variables inside that have a name and value. So as you can see, the block statement very much resembles the object. There is a little differences here and there, like we use colon here and we use equal sign here. We need to provide the keyword before the variable declaration, and here there is no keyword. But other than that, they're very much the same. But we said in the video about statements that the difference between statements and expressions is that all the expressions, they can be either assigned to a variable or they can be printed. And statements cannot be assigned to variables and they cannot be printed. So let's take a look here. We try to assign a block statement to a variable, and then we get a bunch of errors because this is invalid JavaScript syntax, since you cannot assign a statement to a variable. So this is not gonna work. We also cannot print it. So if we try to remove comments here, same situation. We cannot pass a statement where expression is expected. So we get, again, a bunch of errors. At the same time, we cannot really put an object where we would expect a block statement. Here, we cannot use object like this, like we have done that with the block statement, since here everything was fine. It's a legal JavaScript code. But using an object initializer, since it's not a block statement, it's an expression, we cannot use it like this. But we know that we can print it. If we uncomment this code, we can see that we can print this object and we get the same result as we got before. So what happens when we declare an object and assign it to variable? Let's take a look there. So we have a variable dwarf that points at an object. An object, we could say that it points at its properties. That is the first name, last name, and age. And those properties, they point at the values. So the first name points at Thorin, last name points at Oakenshield, and age points at 195. But how do we get values from the object? Because we said that object is this group of properties that points at some values. So how do we get those values? There are 2 ways. We can use dot notation and we can use bracket notation. In order for us to use dot notation, we would use a name of the variable that points at an object. In our case, it's a variable dwarf, followed by dot, followed by the name of the property. In our case, it was first name. Here's another example when we point at variable that points at an object, and then dot, and then the name of the property age. And we get the value this property points at printed in the console. Another way to access property values is through using bracket notation. It's almost like dot notation, but we would use a name of the variable that points at an object followed by square brackets and then the name of the property written as string. So the property was first name, so we pass it as a string. So we wrap it in this single quotes, and the same way we can do it for property age. And again, we get back same result as we got for the dot notation. Since bracket notation is also an expression, we can use it to access properties and, for example, create a new expression. Dwarf first name plus space plus dwarf alias is dwarf age years old. Thorin Oakenshield is 195 years old. In the video about values, we also mentioned that there is another type of objects that still has the object type, but those objects, they are called arrays. Arrays, like an object, is just a collection of values, but they are written with a different notation, square bracket notation. So here we declare a variable called Thorin company that assigned a value of array, which is denoted by the square brackets, and then inside there is a bunch of values separated by commas. So how does that array look like? We have a variable Thorin company that points at array, and then since array is actually an object, instead of having property names that you need to specify, array specifies them for you and it uses number for that. It always starts from number 0 and then goes up. So for this array, where we said it consists of strings Thorin, Balin, Dwalin and Bilbo, our Thorin company variable will be pointing at array, and this array, it will be pointing at property 0 that points at string Thorin. Then it will also point to property 1 that points at Balin, at property 2 that points at Dwalin, and property 3 that points at Bilbo. With an array, you cannot use dot notation, so you cannot write variable representing the array dot index, but you can use only bracket notation. So here we say Thorin company, and then we use bracket notation, and then specify property 0, and we get Thorin back. So if we specify 1, we get Balin back, 2, we get Dwalin back, and 3, we get a Bilbo back. In the video about variables, we have mentioned that variables can be reassigned. Same happens to the object properties. Object properties can have the values reassigned. So here we again refer to an object dwarf we specified above. We use dot notation to access its property first name, and then like with variable we just specify equal some new value. So right now this dwarf.firstName, it points at Thorin. After this reassignment, property first name will be pointing at Balin. Alias will be pointing at null. And in the video about values, we have mentioned that null is for intentionally missing values. So from my knowledge, Balin doesn't have any alias, so his alias will be null. And then finally, we reassign age. For an example, we use a bracket notation because in order to reassign properties, you can both use dot notation to access them or bracket notation to access them. So when we print this updated object, we get an updated result. First name Balin, alias null, age 178. Finally, in the video about variables, we have mentioned that variables declared through var declaration and let declaration, they can be reassigned, while variables created through const declaration cannot be reassigned. Is it the same for the objects? Yes, except there is one nuance. In the video where we declared variables pointing at primitive values, I have shown you, for example, that first name was originally pointing at James and later it was reassigned to pointing at Amos. So if first name was declared through var declaration or let declaration, it could have been reassigned. But if we would declare it through const declaration, this magical link between variable first name and James never could be changed. So you would need to declare some other variable because first name was declared through const. So this link cannot be changed. Same happens to the objects as well. except this nuance. As we can see here, variable dwarf, it points at object. So this link is something that is affected by how you declare dwarf variable. If you declare dwarf variable through var or let declaration, this arrow, this magical link between variable and the object can be changed. If you declare through const declaration, it cannot be changed. But disregarding of how you declare it through var, let or const declaration, properties of the object can always be reassigned, because as we can see here, there are completely different links that connect an object through properties to the actual values. And all of these links, they are not affected by let, var, and const declarations. And this is often a source of confusion, because when you think about const declaration, you sort of think about it that it is constant, it will never change. But in reality, the only thing that never changes is what is the value the variable is pointing at. If we would declare dwarf through const declaration, we still can point its properties to new values. So we can still write dwarf first name equal Dvalin. And it will be perfectly fine. So if we do a console log here, we'll get a first name Dvalin, because dwarf still points to the same object, but its property first name points now to a new value. So here we reassign property first name, but the dwarf still points at the same object. But since dwarf was declared through const declaration, the object it points at cannot be changed. So for example, we cannot say dwarf equal empty object, because we cannot change this link between dwarf and an object. If the dwarf variable though was declared through let declaration, it's perfectly fine, and now our console log prints empty object because the actual object has been changed. So now there is another new empty object at which dwarf is pointing at. So in this video we made even deeper look at variables declarations, since we explored what happens when variables points at non-primitive values. We also have taken a deeper look at non-primitive values themselves, particularly objects. We have seen also two examples of objects, normal objects and arrays. But even though we took a little bit brief look on the arrays, it's intentional, since arrays deserve their own topic and they will have their own video. And there are a few more things that needs to be covered about objects themselves. And in the next video, we will take a look at some other statements that is very useful to write programs, and we try to start writing some programs. See you in the next one.